Welcome, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the Asia Society. I'm Tom Nagorski. I'm the Executive Vice President here. Delighted to have you with us and delighted to welcome back to the Asia Society our good friend Thant Myint-U. We are here to mark, let's do it this way, right, for the folks watching at home, to mark the publication of his latest book, The Hidden History of Burma. But it's also an occasion, as our program title suggests, to do a little bit of a deep dive, as he does in his book, at what exactly has happened in recent history. Thant has a thesis in his book that the history you need to know goes back a lot further than just the recent history that has taken this country on kind of a lurch from military regime to those euphoric moments of just a few years ago, to whatever words you want to use, and Thant will have his own to describe where we stand right now. but fair to say that the country has come back around to being the object of a great deal of criticism and even ostracism from around the world. Before we get started, as always, just a couple of words about upcoming events, and I'm actually going to stick to just one date. We don't normally, actually we never by design double book on a single evening, but the nature of scheduling has meant that, put it this way, any of you who are faithful Asia Society visitors or members, you have no excuse not to be here 2 weeks from tonight on December 2nd, because we have kind of a double billing that should, one or the other should interest everyone. In the auditorium downstairs, a special preview and conversation with the cast and the creative team of the new chamber opera Mila, which is making its North American premiere after a great run in Hong Kong. Mila explores household tensions and educational pressures that are endemic in Hong Kong, with a spotlight on the global phenomenon of immigrant labor. And on this stage that night, I'll be up here in conversation with the Chief Global Affairs Correspondent for ABC News, Martha Raddatz, a conversation about global journalism in the days in which we live, and reporting from flashpoints across Asia, which Martha has done for decades and continues to do. She's one of the most respected reporters in broadcast journalism. So Martha Raddatz here, Mila downstairs, December 2nd, mark your calendars. And as always, for all our programs, please visit asiasociety.org. Our guest tonight has worked in the NGO sector. He's worked in the diplomatic sector. He is a respected historian. He is a highly respected author. He has worked inside Burma and outside the country. And since 2007, he's been part of reform efforts in Burma as a member of its National Economic and Social Advisory Council and as a special advisor to the government on the peace process, among other things. This is his third book, The Hidden History of Burma, and it is terrific. Really a must-read if you want to understand how the country has, as I said, arrived at this moment, along with some prescriptions that he has and that we'll discuss tonight for a better future. We're on the record. This program is being live streamed. And as always, for those watching beyond the room, although there's a good crowd here, so we'll favor those who have made the effort to be in the room. But those of you watching the webcast, if you want to, if you have a question for Thant, please email it to moderator@asiasociety.org, or you can tweet your question using the hashtag AsiaSocietyLive, which is the hashtag for all these events. Please welcome back to the Asia Society, Thant Myint-U.
Yeah.
All right, we'll do it that way. So Thant Myint-U, thanks again for coming. I know you have a busy book launch schedule. And as I said in the open, this really is among other things, a how did we get here story. And you take it a long way back, but I wanted to begin with a couple of quotes taken from the early pages of your book. Here's one. In the early 2010s, Burma was the toast of the world. As the generals appeared to be giving up power, everybody, at least in the West, began to believe that the country was in the midst of an astonishing transformation from the darkest of dictatorships to a peaceful and prosperous democracy. Burma was a morality tale that seemed to be nearing its rightful conclusion. Then the morality tale came crashing down. And Thant has one other, I guess you could say it's more stark, it's a bit maybe lighter as well, but a fact. Quote, in 2016, Burma was on Fodor's guide list of the world's hottest destinations. By 2018, it was on Fodor's list of top 10 places to avoid, which is a kind of flip remark from Fodor's, but it's, it's deadly serious as well. So I want to start with an absurdly general question. It's so general that I asked Thant before whether it's okay to ask it. How did that happen? I mean, that's just taking that last thing, that's 2 short years. And if you were to pick on a couple of key things in brief that you think are to blame or the causes for that rapid decline in what's happened there, what would you emphasize?
Well, I mean, in a way, I think, first of all, let me say thank you very much for having me. It's great to be back at the Asia Society and to see everyone here tonight on this rainy, cold day. I guess, I mean, it's in a way it's an easy question. I mean, from 2016 over the next couple of years, the new government under Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD government, was disappointing to some people in different ways. Some people were critical of the government's handling of the economy. Some people were critical of the direction of the peace process. But at the same time, on those issues, there were many people who were relieved that Burma was finally coming out of decades of dictatorship or quasi-military government, and were really happy to see the NLD in power. I think it was the Rohingya issue, the violence, the expulsion and movement of hundreds of thousands of people across the international border, live and on television, that changed the image of the country so rapidly over such a short period of time. But going back to that first quote that you mentioned, I guess in a way what I've tried to imply and say in the start of the book is that I think that framing of things was always a bit mistaken. You know, the idea that there had been this miraculous transition, that Burma in 2011, 2012 was on this inevitable path towards peace and prosperity and good government and democracy, was always a flawed thing. And I think I started the book with that because I think it was important when I wrote the book in 2017, 2018, to have a more forensic kind of analysis of exactly where we were and what had happened over the previous 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you say flawed assumptions, I'm reminded of something you get at as a key theme in here, but the phrase that I'm about to paraphrase, because I can't quote it exactly, actually came from someone you single out for praise in your book, and there are not that many people you single out for praise, was Ambassador Derek Mitchell, who served after the transition or during the transition for the United States in Burma. And he said that there were way too many people who looked at the country through the prism of the lady and the junta, as in Aung San Suu Kyi and the military regime. And it wasn't that simple. It wasn't that black and white. There's a lot more nuance. I was a journalist, frankly. I'm totally guilty. And my colleagues, to the extent we even paid attention to the country, were always, So what was wrong with that assumption? What was wrong with that prism that here was seemed an unalloyed, iconic, wonderful pro-democracy figure, and on the other side, the bad guys who were as repressive as almost any regimes in the world?
Well, there's nothing wrong with it in the sense that it was, inaccurate back in the 1990s, and in a way it was understandable given the record of the military regime up to that point, and the kinds of things that Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and her colleagues were saying and trying to do. But I guess it was always just a very small part of the picture, and I think people never asked themselves back in the 1990s. We knew in the 1990s that Burma wasn't just a country that was under military dictatorship. It was one of the poorest countries in the world. It was a country in which a very exploitative economic system was emerging. It was a country that was suffering from years of neglect in terms of the education system and the health care system. It was a country that was facing decades, or had faced decades of internal armed conflict. And to think that one person or just a change towards a democratic regime, however successful, could solve all those things, I think was always flawed. I think people always knew that. I think it was just that, it seemed in the 1990s and the 2000s that the military regime wasn't going to go away anytime soon, that focusing on one person, having an iconic figure, having a symbol around which to kind of solidify a sense of opposition to the military regime seemed to make sense, because no one really saw alternatives emerging at that time.
I want to get to history a little bit because it's in the title of the book. It informs a lot of what you say in the book, and in a way, I think another point you make is that we, or the people who got involved at these key moments, hadn't paid enough attention to the history. But before we do that, can we just get to a little bit more of your personal history? I went through, and folks have the bio here, but for those who don't know, Thant's grandfather was U Thant, the Secretary General at the United Nations. Can you talk about, I think you were 8 years old when you made your first trip to Burma, and you were going to bring the body or accompany the body of your grandfather home, right? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I had never been to Burma at that point, but I spoke Burmese. I lived in a Burmese home here. I lived with my grandparents and my parents. My grandfather had just died. He had retired from the UN a few years before, and we were living out in Harrison in Westchester. And my parents flew back with his remains for burial, and that's when there were demonstrations around his funeral. There were riots then subsequently as well. Many people were killed, many people, hundreds of people were arrested around that time. And I don't remember I didn't see all of that myself. I was only 8 years old, almost 9 years old, but it was my first experience in Burma. And so I think both my family history, the things that I heard people around my parents and people around my parents say at that time, my experience in Rangoon in 1974, I think made me feel from a very early age that this was not a good government and that something that needed to change. And so this idea of Burma being under a government that had really dragged the country down, that was oppressive in many ways, that was violent in many ways, under a dictator at the time, General Ne Win, was something that I remember from not just from when I was 8, but from when I was much younger as well.
It's a really vivid part of the book. So from your personal history to the nation's history, and as I said, you take it quite a ways back to, I think it's 1824. Talk a little bit, if you can, about what happened then and why you think, there's a good deal in your book about a history of nativism, a history of nationalism, that I think your thesis would be, and you're not alone, that informs some of the things we're seeing today. Why do we need to understand that to better understand what's happening?
Because I think it's two.
But can you explain what happened then
in 1824? Well, in 1824, you had the first Anglo-Burmese War. So the Burmese, there was a Burmese king, there was a Burmese kingdom. It controlled parts of what is now Burma today, but not all of it. It also controlled parts of what is now Northeast India. And it went to war with the British East India Company. And after about 18 months of very intense and bloody fighting, it lost that war. And the British began to annex parts of what is today Burma. And after annexing parts of what is today Burma, including Arakan, or what is today Rakhine State, it had a second war in 1852 and then a third war in 1885. And out of those 3 different wars, it annexed parts of what had been the Burmese king's domains to what became Assam in northeast India, but a lot of it became the new British Burma, which was in that way an amalgam of both places that were under the control of the old Burmese kings, but also places that had never been under the control of any Burmese king. So I think what's important to remember is that Burma is a modern creation. The Burmese state or the Burmese kingdom goes back 1,000 years. There are different Burmese-speaking kingdoms for 1,000 years, but the Burma with the borders that we have, including Arakan, including the Irrawaddy Valley, including the mountainous areas in which there remains armed conflict on the Chinese border, these were all put together into a British Burma, which then became part of the British Indian Empire. And that birth of Burma under a British military occupation as a racial hierarchy with Europeans at the top, as part of British India, was the creation of this country in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
And in terms of, the phrase you just used, racial hierarchy, the word I used, but used it in the book, nativism. Can you tie it a little bit to what you see going on or what we have seen going on today? Because, again, that's a big part of your book. It's a big part of the story right now. I had not known, I'm not a historian of your country, but you make the case that the seeds of some of the attitudes towards the other were sown a long time ago.
Yeah. Burma was born as part of this particularly exploitative and radical colonial regime. And it was a racial hierarchy, as I mentioned, with Europeans at the top, but it was also a country in which, in the late 19th and early 20th century, millions and millions of people from elsewhere in the British Indian Empire came to settle in Burma, to make a new life, to look for jobs, to the point where in the 1920s, Rangoon rivaled New York as the biggest immigrant port in the world, at a time when the population of the country was about 13 million, up to 2 million people from India, or the rest of India at that time, came to Burma looking for work, mainly poor men. And it was okay for a while, there was economic growth and everything else, but by the 1920s you had developed this sort of Burmese identity that was set against this Indian identity.
Right.
And that was a mix of, I think, people in Burma also feeling anxious, obviously under colonial rule, but seeing this migration of people from outside, from elsewhere, but also married to a kind of colonial ethnography that began in the late 19th century, but certainly by the 1920s, to see people as either indigenous to Burma or as alien to Burma. And this racial categorization of different peoples in Burma under very distinct categories, essential categories, as belonging to this particular group or that particular group, and grouping these races in turn as being either of this country or alien to this country, I think also settled into the Burmese imagining of themselves and who they were. And so with the rise of anti-colonialism and Burmese nationalism, this strong sort of ethnic component and this strong sense of the Burmese as being different and needing to assert their difference as a small country that was always at risk of being overwhelmed by big neighbors to the north, China, and to the west, India, I think is something quite central to the political DNA of the country.
And that works its way into, if I'm not mistaken, is it the 2009 Constitution? I may have my date off, but
2008.
2008 Constitution, so working almost 2 centuries later, this same kind of language is
Yeah,
in
I mean,
there.
so for a while it was fine. I mean, so you have this Burmese nationalist movement. You had World War II, which many people forget. Burma was the country in Asia,
giant
most
battlefield.
battlefield
yeah.
destroyed by World War II. You had a nationalist elite then come to power as the British quit the country in 1947-48. And then you had, as well as a socialist sort of government, you had not a nativist government in the 1950s, but a government that also saw this Burmese identity as very different. But then at that time, because Burma became independent as what was British Burma, there was then a need to try to unify other peoples that were seen as indigenous to the country, like the Shan or the Karen,
Right.
with this Burman ethnic core. And that project has never been successful. And so from the Burmese majority perspective, the project is to assimilate, integrate others who are seen as indigenous while holding at arm's length people who are seen as alien to the country. But for those minority peoples like the Shan and Karen, this attempt by the Burmese majority to integrate them is seen as a big part of the problem over the last 70 or 80 years. Now by the 1980s under General Ne Win, with the 1982 citizenship law and a number of other things that were less legal but more practice, this sort of nativist idea of the country belonging to only certain people, not belonging to others, grew up in isolation and became further and further entrenched, as I mentioned before, not just in law, but mainly in practice.
Right. Okay. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now, and at the risk of doing exactly what Ambassador Mitchell and you have warned against and focusing too much on Aung San Suu Kyi, there are, I think, fundamental questions I at least, and I suppose some members of our audience and around the world can't help but ask. So I have only met her once in my life, and it was when I was a journalist, and it was in 1989, just before she was put under house arrest. It was about an hour in her villa, and things were pretty tense at the time. Like a great many other people, in just the course of one interview, she impressed enormously with her charisma, her quiet charisma, her courage, and everything else, and then her bravery in the years to come. And a few decades later, the next time I saw her, I didn't meet her, you were there as well, 2012 in Oslo. She finally is able to get her Nobel Peace Prize, which she had won in absentia. And there, it's not just a euphoric moment for the country, supposedly, or presumably, it's also an incredible moment for this woman. And I guess I'm getting to what happened to her a little bit, but you have in your book a remarkable few passages, and I wonder if you could say more about it, where I guess on the fringes of the Oslo meeting in 2012, you and Bono, there's all these celebrities who became involved with Burma because it was, this cause célèbre, and she was who she was, and you go off for a private meeting about Burma's future. Get us in the room with you a little bit. What went on there? What kind of a moment was that for you, given all the work you've done in your country?
No. Well, with Bono, he was very interested, actually. He asked lots of different questions, and he was particularly interested in EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and wanted Burma to sort of sign up for that. So I remember we had a discussion about that. But I think what's important to remember about that time is that it's not the case that, we had this heroic, charismatic leader iconic resistance against the military dictatorship, and suddenly that military dictatorship just sort of crumbled away, right? I think it's important to remember that what we have right now is the 2008 Constitution, which you mentioned, which is not a democratic constitution. It's a hybrid constitution. But more importantly, it's a constitution that the army has been preparing since 1993, 1994. So this is not something that they gave way to under pressure or as a result of a grassroots movement or a revolutionary movement. It's something that they have actually wanted to do for a very long time. And in the late 2000s, when General Thant Myint-U was about to turn 80 and wanted to retire, he not dusted it off, but he finished off this process and basically, against a lot of opposition, at least by activists and people outside and by the NLD, put this framework in place, which is what we have now. I think the reason we got to that point in 2012 was because two things happened. One is that the ex-generals that he put into place under that new constitutional setup went beyond the script and undertook a whole series of liberalizing moves, like the release of political prisoners and the freeing up of the internet and everything else, that impressed a lot of people in 2011 and early 2012. And at exactly that moment, when Derek was also envoy, Derek Mitchell was envoy, the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton, looking for ways in which to engage the Burmese generals, found that the Burmese generals were doing just enough to justify that engagement and began to roll back sanctions. So, we're living still in the world created in 2011 of actually much greater political freedom that we've had since 1962, and, in many ways, the ending of the kind of isolation that we had from the West from 1990 or so onwards. But it was never the case that we were in the midst of this remarkable transition because of this momentum that had been generated through a democracy movement. On the contrary, in the late 2000s, the democracy movement was almost on its last legs in the sense that people were locked up, hundreds were in prison, many were exiled. And so I think we have to be very clear on the dynamics of change, because that tells us a lot about where things might go and where they might not go in the future.
I mean, people, right, I think in many parts of the world saw this as a Berlin Wall kind of moment, but and actually, I think about Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, or for that matter, Nelson Mandela. But the difference, I guess, is you're saying is all the other pieces of the autocracy went away, whereas in Burma, the military was still there.
It was an entrenched military regime which, from a position of confidence and strength, took a step back. And that some people from within that regime, or the regime that was then set up, decided to go further than was expected. But by 2014, 2015, the inertia or the momentum from that liberalization had begun to wear out.
Right.
I don't think, or to put it another way, I don't think that the establishment, the military establishment in general, had expected to go so far so fast. And there were many other dynamics at play by 2014, 15 as well.
I want to get to that horrible series of events in 2016, but before we do, you personally, in whether it's when you're meeting with Bono and Aung San Suu Kyi or anywhere in that time frame where things were really looking up, how did you feel, given all the work you had done in a whole range of sectors just as a Burmese citizen, how did you feel? Were you euphoric? Were you?
No, I think I think a lot of us were really frantic, because I think it was very obvious from the inside to see how fragile this situation was and how small the window was that we had. Because I think what people often didn't see from the outside were the internal fights from within the military, broader military establishment, meaning the government at the time, the ex-generals, where the reformist generals were actually, in many ways, always on a back foot. And I think people, and we saw an increasing dynamic of kind of intra-elite conflict as well between different ex-generals, between the parliament and the government. And everything looked, again, much more fragile from the inside than I think it did on the outside. So it was a question of how far could we get things so that it would be hard for things to turn back or to snap back to the situation before. And I think, I think people assume that we had a number of years, it wasn't a decade or more, but a number of years before you had to put certain inevitable kind of process, not inevitable, but processes that couldn't go backwards into place.
Right. Now, there's a unanswerable what-if question, I guess, as to whether, had those been the only challenges, could the situation today be better? But the fact of the matter is, I was going to say all hell broke loose. That's a little bit glib, but talk if you can, remind the audience what happened in terms of the initial attack and then the counterattack in October 16 in Rakhine State.
Yeah, in October, I mean, if we just go back a few months, I think when Aung San Suu Kyi came into office in the spring of 2016, she took a fairly courageous step of appointing Kofi Annan as the head of a commission to look to see what could be done to resolve the conflict in Rakhine between Muslims and Buddhists and more generally. And she wouldn't have appointed someone like Kofi Annan, I think, if she had wanted to kind of dictate what was going to happen. So she did that and looking for a sustainable solution. Just as Kofi Annan was appointed, though, later that year began his work, this group called ARSA, the Arakan Rohingya Solidarity Army, emerged, attacked government security forces. That led to a ferocious response. You had the first wave of tens of thousands of refugees going to Bangladesh. The Rohingya issue, which had been on people's minds anyway because of the boat crisis a couple of years before, where you saw people trying to flee towards or move towards Thailand and Malaysia, that became front and center of people's consciousness about Burma. And over the next several months, over the late 2016 and 2017, the tensions rose. I mean, on the one hand, you had the desperate plight of people who were in the country. You had this new insurgency or militant group that was mobilizing or trying to mobilize villagers at the same time. You had different accounts of violence taking place over those months, over every week or every couple of weeks. And in Rangoon, I think, and to some extent in Naypyidaw and certainly on the ground, you had this great paranoia. I think you had a tremendous fear on both sides in both these communities. But in Rangoon, you also had this paranoia because people had this image of this group as being an Islamicist group or an Islamic terrorist group.
Propagated, is it correct to say, by Facebook to some extent?
I don't think Facebook as an institution propagated.
No.
Right. But as a platform, because I think what happened was, for people who don't know, Burma went through a telecoms revolution beginning 2013. So we went from 2% mobile phone penetration to 98, 99% smartphone penetration over an incredibly short period of time, and Facebook was the #1 platform. So at exactly the moment that people went online, so to speak, you had both the reports of the initial communal violence in Rakhine between Buddhists and Muslims in 2012. You had people saying whatever they wanted on Facebook about that, and there was a lot of hate speech as well on Facebook as a result. You had a strain of of Buddhism that always saw, not Buddhism, but of Buddhist leadership that saw Islam as a threat to Buddhism, and now those ideas were propagated on Facebook as well. And then you had people seeing for the first time, global Islamic terrorism, ISIS and others in Syria, in Iraq, live and on color on Facebook videos. And all of these things, I think, merged in people's minds, this idea that there was this Islamic threat. And then here's this new militant group attacking government forces in Arakan. I think that had an effect of creating this wave of paranoia that might have then been stoked up by different people as well. So when ARSA attacked again in August of 2017, just as Kofi Annan submitted his report, the whole, I wouldn't say the whole country or the whole society, but I would say that the atmosphere was there for the army to respond in a no-holds-barred way and enjoy full support in doing so.
So hindsight is always a tricky thing, but back to Aung San Suu Kyi for a moment. So there, as you say, there's this paranoia being stoked, however it's stoked throughout the country. There are hundreds of thousands now, people who are crossing into Bangladesh or stuck at the border or whatever, and by the way, bringing with them these just absolutely horrific stories, in some cases pretty well documented, of what has happened along the way. And what I guess I've never quite understood, and it is a hindsight question, is with all the moral capital or currency that Ms. Suu Kyi had in her country, around the world, because it's often said, well, she couldn't come out and take a big stand because of public opinion in her country or because of the hold that the military had. Could she not then, could she not now? I guess she's lost some of that moral currency or a lot of it, but could she not have, been brave in the way she had been as a dissident and said to her people, yes, we have an issue with this group. Yes, we're not going to condone and sit still when there's all this violence. but we're also not going to condone all this horror that's happening to the Rohingya.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, it's a couple of different things. I mean, one is you had that general mood on social media, but I think you also have to ask yourself, you know, does that really matter? I mean, like I said, social media
Does what really matter?
No, the sort of mood in social media, how reflective of is it of the rest of the country?
Right.
I remember also speaking to young Burmese people around that time in 2017 who also said, don't take this too seriously in the sense that people, you know, people write all kinds of things on Facebook, comment in all kinds of different ways. It doesn't necessarily represent a depth of feeling. I guess what I'm saying is that I think people's attitudes could still be formed in different ways.
Sure.
And I think what people said at that time, whether it's Aung San Suu Kyi or other leaders or people outside, I think made a difference or could make a difference as well. But it's not just about what people say and what people don't say as well. I mean, I think we have to take apart two very different things. One is the specific situation on the ground, which led to ARSA emerging, attacking the army, and the army's response and the violence that happened in the refugee outflow. And you have to ask yourself, even if Facebook didn't exist, even if social media in Burma didn't exist, even if that kind of, you know, sort of general feelings in Rangoon about Islamic terrorism didn't exist, would the same thing has happened? And I think it's possible, because all we have to look at is the record of 70 years of insurgency and counterinsurgency.
Mm-hmm.
This is not the first time that civilians have been attacked. This is not the first time that villages have been burned down. The scale of it is different.
Right.
And the intensity of the feeling because of social media may be slightly different. But again, I think we have to disaggregate. And I think we have to ask ourselves, you know, would what happened in Arakan or Rakhine in 2017 have happened
no matter what?
No matter what. And I think the atmosphere that was created by social media did make a difference, but I don't think it was decisive. I think what did also make a difference, and it's harder to say in a way, is that because it was happening in a more democratic space, a competitive political space,
mm-hmm.
those people, and I'm not saying Aung San Suu Kyi, but across the board, who may have wanted to take risky moves or do things that might have been politically unsavory or unpopular, didn't feel they had the political capital to do that. And that's true of the last government as well, where after the communal violence in 2012, I think a dictatorship might have actually acted in a certain way, but in a more competitive political space, no one also wanted to take the responsibility for taking aggressive moves that might have been unpopular.
I guess my question is, if Aung San Suu Kyi, given how revered she was, couldn't take that risk, who could? And again, she had, at least outside her country, but I think within as well, she had built that that capital on the basis of being an incredibly strong moral human being.
Sure. But I think we have
yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
I think there's a few different things. I mean, one is, you know, what should political leaders be saying in order that feelings of racial or ethnic discrimination, prejudice towards others in society, to the extent that a younger generation grows up with different feelings about others, I think that's one set of issues.
Mm-hmm.
That's very different from have specific soldiers or army officers been guilty of crimes against humanity, and what kind of accountability is possible,
right.
and is it even possible in this context in Burma to imagine accountability or any government acting towards achieving accountability. That's different yet again for how do you create the conditions in which refugees might come home or IDPs might be able
mm-hmm.
to go back to their homes and access health and education. I mean, all of these are very different mm-hmm. political dynamics, or these involve very different political dynamics.
What did she wind up doing? I don't recall, with the recommendations of Kofi Annan's commission.
Well, the government has said that they're moving forward on many of these recommendations, but they're moving forward in very partial ways, and I think that's reflective of a number of things. It might be reflective of political will, but it's also reflective of something which I think is really important to understand, which is that, you know, from the outside, because it was a military dictatorship, we assume that it's a very strong state structure that can kind of do whatever it wants.
Right.
And actually, it's an incredibly weak and fragile state structure where whatever is decided in Naypyidaw actually almost never happens on the ground. So how one actually implements the kinds of recommendations that are in the Kofi Annan report, I'm not saying it's impossible, and I'm not saying they aren't political issues of political will, but I think we have to also realize that there are huge issues in terms of capacity in doing some of these things as well.
Now, I don't want to get into all the detail, but Aung San Suu Kyi is not the only one who comes in for criticism in your book. You're pretty withering about the United Nations, about some in the United States. And am I right that basically your point is that so much attention was paid to the idea of fostering and promoting democracy, and on the other side of the ledger, very, very little, relatively speaking, to development, to how this country that was incredibly poor, ethnic conflict all over the place. I mean, is that your...
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I think, democracy is great. And I think, in a way, it's about also what kind of democracy we're going to have, and not to think about democracy simply in terms of having multi-party elections and that's it. And in a way, I think if an emphasis had been placed on some other aspects of a more deliberative democracy, in terms of things like rule of law, in terms of things like freedom of media and building up a strong independent media and independent judiciary, I think those are things that are important as well. Mm-hmm. And it's about how do we sequence those things, right? Now, no one had the benefit of deciding those things because everything was under the military dictatorship until 2011. But still, I think we have to think about the sequencing of things in order to achieve a more sustainable democracy. Instead, what we have is that we have this incredibly exploitative economic system. And this is what I try to argue in my book, is that people think of the history or the recent political history of Burma in terms of the history of the democracy movement since 1988 and the uprising there. But equally important, I think, is the history of Burmese capitalism since 1989. Mm-hmm. In 1989, the Burmese way to socialism collapsed. The military junta which took over transitioned the country to a free market system. But it transitioned to a free market system at exactly the same time that the border to China was open, at exactly the same time that the Communist Party insurgency collapsed on the Chinese border, at exactly the same time as that communist insurgency fractured into different militia groups with whom the army regime signed or agreed to ceasefires, mm-hmm. When many of these militia then went into a whole slew of different industries, illegal and illicit, which then gave birth to a certain type of Burmese capitalism mm-hmm. that has mutated and evolved over a quarter century, and that has mutated and evolved under Western sanctions and in isolation from global markets as well. And a central argument in my book is that it's that system and the dynamics from that economic system, whatever you want to call it, but it's a type of capitalism, which determines so much of day-to-day experiences in Burma and the dynamics that actually govern the country. And without thinking about that and where that should go, a simple transition at the top to a different kind of constitutional system is, I think, at best going to be partial, and at worst, it's going to have all kinds of unintended consequences as well.
Right. Well, you've neatly brought us close to the present, or maybe even to the present now, and I want to just, and we'll come to the audience in a moment because there are Burma watchers in this room who are way smarter than I am. But it is worth noting, and you do in the book, that for all this doom and gloom, there's been a great deal of positive change, right? I mean, you've mentioned the country is considerably more free. That great stat you just mentioned, 2% internet connectivity, now 98%. Economic growth, that as I understand it, has hit rural areas as well. But going forward, since so much of what we've been talking about is history and hindsight and all the rest, you say in the latter part of the book, quote, Burma needs a radical agenda, a new project of the imagination. What's in that? You've advised the government for some time. You're sitting now with the leadership. And by the way, with the outside world that still to some extent stands ready to help. What's needed?
Well, I think for me the most difficult thing in writing the book was to try to figure out whether I wanted to end on a positive or a negative note, right? And
by the way, here we love ending on positive notes.
Because there's such huge positives and negatives in a way. Like you said, I mean, the country is far freer than for almost all people, and excluding many people now in Rakhine State and people in the Northeast who are also displaced and affected by conflict. For many people, life is better than at any time in the past 40, 50 years. That's true. There has been economic growth, and even for the middle 40, 50% of the country, I think their incomes have gone up substantially over the past many years. At the same time, this is a country where there is intense armed conflict. There is these, not just the Rohingya violence, but other hundreds of thousands of other people who've been displaced over the past 10 years. Kachin people, Arakanese Buddhists, Rakhine Buddhist people have been displaced by recent violence as well. You have hundreds of different militia, an exploding methamphetamine industry worth billions of dollars. And then you have these incredibly fragile state structures, a democracy transition that's half finished at best, and a society that's really reeling from decades of poor education and poor healthcare, where 30% of kids are still stunted, more than 30% suffer from malnutrition growing up. And it's incredible. It's the poorest country in ASEAN, which is trying to rejoin the world as a poor and weak country, which is almost bound to lead to all kinds of different outcomes. And then, so for me, that's almost a 50-50 thing in terms of positives and negatives. You have a young generation that really, I think, wants to catch up with the rest of the world and do well. But then you add on top of that climate change and the impact that climate change is inevitably going to have over the next 20, 30 years. And it is difficult to be positive, I think. And I think in terms of thinking about the future, I think constitutional reform issues are stuck. I think the peace process is stuck. I think no one has a good idea in terms of what to do in Rakhine, both with the current insurgency and also with the refugees in Bangladesh. But I think there are two doors that are open that need to be kind of pushed through. One is, I think, before we even think about constitutional futures, we should have a radical program of anti-discrimination in the country, where all people in Burma, regardless of race and religion, should not only be seen as sort of belonging to the country and being treated equally, but instances of discrimination being actively condemned and sought out and prosecuted if it's a violation of the law. But secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, I think to think through and reimagine what the political economy of the country should be. The last 25 years of economic growth have engendered a system which is far more unequal than anything that we've had since colonial times. And it's engendered a system that has destroyed a lot of the natural environment in the country. And Burma, unlike many other poor countries, has so many options. I mean, we can have an economy that's based on tourism, on extraction, on manufacturing, on just exporting 3 or 4 products to China alone could probably drive a lot of the economy. But it's about people thinking through what kind of society do they want. Do they want a more equal society or not? Do they want something else? And I think that basic discussion of the kind of economy, the kind of political economy we have, is a discussion that's completely missing because there's been a complete divorce from the realm of politics, which is completely focused on constitutional and legal issues, and the realm of economics, which has been completely relegated to technical experts and not to these broader issues about the kind of future society we want.
So it's a really great and thoughtful answer, although in the course of it, I found myself toggling between, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? I mean, do you come out then thinking that those doors to a better future are?
I just don't think it's going to be one or the other. I think my guess would be that the next 10, 15, 20 years in Burma will be really interesting. And I think it's going to be a very mixed place where you're going to see islands of growth and innovation and people doing much better off, maybe in Rangoon, maybe in elsewhere. And then it's going to be a place where, just 100 miles away, you're going to have incredibly poor people and people displaced by conflict and people really have no hope for the future. I think that's the likely thing. But that's not a good thing, though. And I think this other path of coming towards a much more inclusive society in which there is some kind of direction in terms of political economy, I think is there. I just feel that we're so far from the discourse around that. And I think from the outside also we do very little to encourage that kind of discourse. I think is a big problem as well.
Okay, I want to start, I said there are Burma watchers in the room. My colleague Deborah Eisenman up here in the front has been there many times, and speaking of euphoric moments, she and her team helped bring in that fall of 2012 President Thant Myint-U to the Asia Society, Aung San Suu Kyi to the Asia Society, all these conferences. Actually, one was held in this room in 2013 to map out a road to prosperity. Anyway, Deborah, do you have a question for Thant Myint-U?
Thank you so much for coming. This was fascinating, and the book is wonderful, very informative. I have a number of questions. I'll try to keep it to one. there are elections coming up at the end of next year, about the same time as ours here in the States. A lot of times in new democracies or new hybrid systems, you're not really running on platforms or any real outcomes. But what do you see happening in this next election? Do you see coalition governments being formed? Do you see ethnic parties coming to the fore in a new way that can maybe push forward economic development in other areas of the country?
Yeah, I think we're likely, we'll have elections almost certainly in almost the same week as elections here. I think that they will probably be largely free and fair elections, at least better than most others in the region, if not all others in the region. I think that the election is very much the NLD's to lose. I think the NLD will do very well. 60% plus of the constituencies in the country are in the Burmese heartland, in the core Irrawaddy Valley. And almost all of those constituencies voted for the NLD in 2015 by large margins of 70, 80%. You would need a big swing away from the NLD for other parties to win, and I just don't see that happening. I think many people, despite problems with government performance or disappointments, I think essentially feel, look, after 50, 60 years of military-backed government, this group has only been in power for 3-4 years. Let's give them a chance. Who else do we have? We're not going to go back to a party of ex-generals or anyone else, I think is going to be the view of many. And I think others who are more dissatisfied will probably not vote, and we might see a lower voter turnout. I think that dynamic is different amongst some ethnic minority communities who are particularly disappointed and who have ethnic minority parties for whom to vote. And so I think those ethnic minority parties will get a bigger percentage of the vote, but under a first-past-post system. And because so many constituencies, even in ethnic states, are mixed constituencies, I think it'll be very hard, even if those parties merge or combine, to do that much better than they have in the past election. I think a fear that I would have is that a lot of ethnic minority leaders and a new generation will try to do their best to contest these elections well, to merge some of their parties together. But on the other side of it, if they don't see any greater role for themselves in government, they will be that much more disappointed with democratic processes themselves, which is kind of what we saw in Rakhine State in 2015, 2016.
Thank you. Since I still have the mic in my hand, I'm going to ask one more before I pass it on.
Go for it.
If that's okay. You talked about younger generations in ethnic states, and I'm wondering, even if you look at the NLD, which many of its leaders are in their 70s, do we see a next generation being put forward by Aung San Suu Kyi, and also a different type of person? So, for instance, you talk in the book about U Kony, who was very sadly assassinated, but also a Muslim man. Do we see her being willing to put forward people of different faiths to help bring forward a kind of more tolerant?
Yeah, I guess we'll know very soon, because the NLD will have to choose its slate of candidates for the election imminently. And so I guess then we'll know if, and I think there have been different things that have been said in recent weeks about younger people and different people and people who will need to kind of impress their constituencies. So it's possible there'll be a change in candidates, and I guess looking at those candidates we'll have an answer to your question. But I think even within the NLD, it's not quite clear exactly what direction that's going, but we'll know within a couple of months. Maureen.
Hi.
Maureen.
I'm Maureen.
Another great Burma watcher. You want to introduce yourself, Maureen?
I'm an eminence grise, more grise than eminent. I've known that for a long time. So Thant, how would you, if you were king of Naypyidaw, elected or not, how would you extricate the military and their connections? You mentioned some of the stuff that happened with the Chinese, that various groups that are in the illicit. Mm-hmm. How are you going to extract them, really? And is there a chance for a sort of a non-democratic but basically acceptable sort of a Thai regime, military never going away, because they deliver something? What are the chances of that happening?
Well, I guess the thing is that, with Aung San Suu Kyi, I think is an incredibly, for many, especially ethnic Burmese majority people, is still an incredibly popular figure. So I think as long as she's around, I think the NLD is going to be the dominant party. But I think in the future, when she's not around, I think you will have a much more flat political landscape of 100 different, sort of political leaders vying for power. And in that situation, if we continue to have an extremely unequal, economically unequal society with tremendous wealth inequality, people incredibly anxious about the future, where people are mobilizing around ethnic identities and identities on social media and elsewhere, where people are thinking mostly about race and identity issues, and at the same time very fearful of where things are going to go in terms of their own economic future, we're setting things up for a kind of populist strongman type figure, as we've seen in so many other countries. And I think that's almost the default situation going forward, whether it's an ex-general or somebody else. I mean, who knows? I think a point that I try to make in my book, though, is about the military extracting itself from the economy. I don't think we need to see it in that way, because I think my sense is that these networks around businesses making money or people making money in a corrupt way or in other ways, the rackets around drugs, around all kinds of different economic activities in the country, are now so entrenched and so powerful. I think they're much more entrenched and much more powerful than any institution in the country. And it's not the army as an institution being involved, it's individual people of, across the bureaucracies, across the army, across society, across ceasefire lines, across ethnic and religious lines as well. And so I think we have this system that's grown up in the shadow of the formal state since 1989. That is the thing that's kind of moving things forward in terms of day-to-day life and decisions. And I just think a much bigger spotlight needs to be put on how that works and how that can change. And actually, I think that, across Burmese society, people are actually surprisingly very open to ideas. I think if we focus on a few things like constitutional reform, we might be kind of banging on a door that's kind of not going to open anytime very soon. I'm not saying people shouldn't try, and obviously the Constitution needs to change in many ways. But I think this discussion about what kind of economy do we want that everyone can be involved in, I think even business leaders will want to have that discussion. I don't think business leaders just want to kind of leave the economy to technocrats and just an open door to foreign competition. I think if there's a good discussion about the kind of economy that we want in the future, that's good for poor people and it's inclusive as well, I think a lot of people across the board, and I think that's where you get even ethnic armed organization leaders and people on the military side more interested as well.
All right, rest of the room. Yes, let's go favor the back for a moment.
Hey, thank you guys for the rich dialogue. In terms of the nation...
Do you mind introducing yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Dan New. I'm just here to enjoy the conversation. Limited background on Burma, but in terms of the nation that you see impacting the future of Burma most, whether that be positive or negative impact, who would that be?
Yeah, China.
And why?
Like most other countries.
Yeah, I mean, almost every country in the world thinks about the rise of China and how it will impact them. And I think Burma will be impacted by China probably more than any other country I can think of in the world, because it's not just this huge country next door, but it's a country that is now 4, 5, 6 times richer than Burma, which is new. If you look at Yunnan province, which is next to Burma, 45 million people, its per capita GDP was more or less the same as Burma 15, 20 years ago. Now it's 4 or 5 times greater since 2009. So just the gravity of China next door, whatever government policies there are, whatever China's government tries to do in terms of Belt Road Initiative and everything else, I think just the gravity of China's economy is already having huge impacts across Burma. And it's not a regulated border. It's not a strong state on the Burmese side that can regulate that trade. It's an open border with thousands and thousands of people and firms and investors and others coming across, not on a daily basis, but on a weekly, monthly basis. And I just don't see, given everything that we've said about the situation in Burma today, that Burma will have anything like the capacity to manage and regulate what could be a great opportunity, having this, one of the fastest growing markets and big markets in the world right next door, to successfully exploit its position next to China. And instead, you will have this unregulated border. And I think there's already a perception that Chinese projects, Chinese economic projects fuel corruption, lead to environmental damage, displace people from the land. And I think we're also setting things up for potential, more tense situation between China and China's economic sort of agents in the country and the local population as well.
I was going to ask about that, just a quick follow-up. Is there to the extent people have opinions about that? I know the Japanese have been quite involved in development in other countries. Do they, does the average citizen in your experience, have opinions about who they'd prefer to come in with a big project or a?
No, I think you can divide it in a few different. I mean, I think the average poor person in the country probably
Has no
doesn't
idea,
think
yeah.
about this very much, except those that have been directly impacted because their land has been confiscated by a project that's Chinese
Yeah.
or something else. I think there, on the other hand, I think there are a lot of people and a new generation of people in places like Shan State or in Mandalay who have benefited from Chinese investment and Chinese business partners, and you have a lot of young people who are learning Chinese. So I think we have to be fair and say that there's that element and dynamic as well. But I think in the political class, in the Burmese political class in Rangoon, the overwhelming opinion is one of deep anxiety about China, if not outright kind of sort of a dislike of the idea of being overly dependent on China. And you're right that Japan and other countries are investing as well. But not, no one is offering anything like what China is offering at the moment in terms of infrastructure projects and general economic investment.
A question here, I think.
Hi, good evening. I am Dr. Marguerite Sainon Saith. I'm the great-great-granddaughter of King Bajido, and I live here in New York. And I went to Myanmar in 2013 and traveled with Ashin Sandima, who was second to UNU and was in, he was exiled. And I got a lot of input and feedback. I spent a month there after the country opened up, and it was very, very painful of what I saw throughout what happened. I lived in Myanmar from 1958 and left in 1967, 68 after my father died. He built the sugar mills, he built the rum and all that. And what I saw was the generals had taken over the country, and the places that I grew up in and all that were all, it was very, very painful what I was seeing. And I got personal accounts for the 1988 demonstration. Thant Myint-U said, and this was from the highest level, that they were to shoot to kill for the demonstration that happened. And for the rum industry was very unregulated. And Thant Myint-U said, let them be drunk. And I traveled to Myanmar, and what I saw was the Chinese presence there, where there was bumper-to-bumper traffic day and night. I slept in the monastery on the road to Yunnan, and it was painful, the raping of the country that's happening on an ongoing basis. I went into the forest, and I saw all the teak trees being cut. We need help in Myanmar to change what has happened. I went into Xiawadi, where my father built a sugar mill prior to his death. And what I saw was mountains of needles on it with no health care, roaches everywhere, the ceiling collapsing. This is what I saw. The people were very fearful because I wanted to see what the schools were being, how they were. And there was a lot of fear as the country opened up. Myanmar needs a lot of help. Thank you.
I don't know if you have a response to that. I should, in all the many things you have done, the question referred to the raping of the country. You've done a ton of work. It's called the Yangon Heritage Trust, is that right?
Yeah.
About just what's happened in the city itself to try to preserve. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Maybe just add in one other point. I mean, one is Yangon Heritage Trust. So it's an organization, NGO, that managed to help stop the demolition of old architecture and save the old town in Yangon. But what we've also tried to do is begin a discussion in Yangon about urban planning. And Myanmar is a country which was only about 15-20% urbanized. It's now increasingly urbanized, and urban planning wasn't even a topic. And we felt, given the experiences in Bangkok and Jakarta and Manila and elsewhere, that it was very good to try to start a discussion about what kind of cities do people want to live in. And actually, if we think about ethnic conflict and religious conflict and racial conflict in Burma, in the future, it's not going to be the case that people are going to be living in isolated mountain communities of one ethnic group which could have autonomy. People will be living together, and they're already living together in cities. And so planning for multicultural, multi-ethnic cities, I think, in the country is a really important part of, really important challenge going forward. But the lady had mentioned needles and things. I think what I haven't mentioned yet, but I think is really important also in understanding what's happening in the country today, is that Burma is home now to the world's biggest methamphetamine industry, which the UN estimates is worth anywhere from $60 to $70 billion a year, which is bigger than the formal economy. The methamphetamine is produced in northern Shan State in areas controlled by a couple of different militia groups. The high-end methamphetamines, crystal meth, goes to markets in Australia and New Zealand and Japan and elsewhere, whereas cheaper synthetic drugs go to local markets and markets in Bangladesh, Thailand, and in neighboring countries. And if you haven't seen a recent Reuters investigation, you should read it. It's very interesting. Basically, this investigation, which is based partly on the work of the Australian Federal Police, has discovered that this methamphetamine industry in Myanmar is not under the control of different cartels, but under a single mega syndicate controlled by one kingpin, whose personal income is believed to be as much as $18 billion a year, who's a Canadian Chinese, whose whereabouts are not known, but he's sort of the Pablo Escobar of our times. But yet, until now, nobody actually even knows his name. Now we know his name, but until recently, nobody even knew his name. So this is just an example. Even if the UN is way off and it's not $60 billion a year, but it's $10 billion or $20 billion, it's a huge amount of money. And it's just an indication that there's a whole bunch of stuff happening in the economic realm that, because of our focus on some slice of the politics, we're missing what is actually animating life and decisions in Burma today.
Sure. Sanjeev, I'll leave the microphone passing to you.
Hi, my name is Susu, and I'm a student at Columbia from Mandalay.
From Mandalay, you said?
Yes, from Mandalay. I spent my first 18 years at Mandalay. Do you think Burma's religious atmosphere positively or negatively affected the country's development? And if it is positively, how is it positive? And if it is negative, how do you think the religious atmosphere of our country should reform? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, I would say that it's an intensely religious country. So whether people are Buddhist or Christian or Muslim or Hindu, you see so much religious activity, and I think people take their religion incredibly seriously, and it's a big part of it, I think how people structure their lives and think about their future. And the good part of that is you see a huge number of people who devote hours and hours every week, not just to kind of religious activities themselves, but to charities and faith-based kind of organizations that do charity work around the country. And you see this everywhere from the Baptist church up in Kachin State to monasteries in Rangoon. And I guess that's a good thing. I think in terms of how it kind of impacts political culture in the country, to what extent it's helping move forward or holding back the democratic transition, how much it's impacting people's notions of identity, I think that's a much harder question to answer. And I think within each religion, there are also different new intellectual currents. And we see within Buddhism, Mabatha, which is the Burmese kind of Buddhist nationalist movement, but which grew in an atmosphere of opposition to what it perceived as a kind of very corrupt and unfair modernization under military rule, which has one strain which sees Islam as a threat, but also has many other strains which has kind of spoken out against military corruption, for example, as well. But it's so complex, and I think within, again, each religion, you have different elements right now, so it's hard to say. Maybe the only other thing I could say is that, I think Burma is still a culture, for the majority Buddhists, who are 85% plus of the country, I think Buddhism and people's thinking about their next life and all of these things which people take very seriously is such an important part of how people act and plan things. And yet, we almost, when we talk about the politics of the country, we almost never factor in these issues. That's not a very good answer to your question. I think it's a good question. I think it's really important. But what the net impact is on the other issues that we've been talking about, I think is much more difficult to say.
Oh boy, there's a lot. About this woman here.
Thank you for another terrific book. Could you talk a little bit about the landscape of civil society organizations and the importance or perhaps the futility of continuing to grow that sector, and the opportunities that might be pave the way for some of the opportunities to put a spotlight on some of the issues you've been talking about in relation to the economy.
Yeah, I think it's really, I think it's really good. I think it's really good that there's a space. I think it's really good that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of new civil society organizations. I think it's really good that many of them are actively trying to discuss things that haven't been discussed before and trying to promote various issues, progressive issues in a good way. I've worked with many different NGOs that are trying to look at some of the issues that I've talked about today. But I think it's no substitute for a state-led progressive agenda, which is completely missing in many ways in the country. And this is the thing. I think, it's fine for NGOs, CSOs to be promoting issues around anti-discrimination, and a few do, issues to help poor people in the country, and many do. But what we need is a root and branch, almost wholesale reform of the state's education and healthcare sectors, and come up with a plan to urgently urgently help the 20, 30, 40% of poor people who are in dire straits despite whatever economic growth there's been over the past 10 years. And no civil society activity can take the place of a government agenda to do that. And that's, the government has a $15 billion budget. Now, that budget is eaten up in different ways. We can get into where that budget goes. But it's the state that needs to be rebuilt around a progressive agenda, right? Because otherwise, what's the point of democracy? And I think when we think about the parts of the country that are outside of state control, I don't think ethnic minority communities will welcome a peace that brings in the state as it is and the economy as it is, which is quite exploitative, coupled with a weak state that doesn't give them anything in the way of public services. Whereas I think if we have a state at the center that is genuinely progressive and that provides all of its citizens equally health, education, and basic social welfare, then I think that is the state in which around which you can build a much more sustainable peace process as well.
$15 billion budget. What did you say that meth figure was?
60 billion.
60.
Well, that's the UN's estimate, yeah.
Yes, right next to you, John.
Thank you. My name is Kinwe Weinstein. I am a big fan of Myanmar. I went there many times. The question is that Myanmar has 135 minorities, different people. And I would like to ask you your opinion about Rakhine State and Rohingya. You have many different people, and also you mentioned 85 or 90% is a Buddhist, but also religiously it is homogeneous. But in Yangon, as far as I have seen, the Jews, Muslims, and everyone gets along. So I'm puzzled what's the difference in Rohingyas?
You have a whole chapter on this, right?
There's not that many Jews in Myanmar. No. There's maybe 10 or so. Sorry. The synagogue, a beautiful synagogue exists, and it's
maybe one or two families when I was
one or two families, and expat people of the Jewish faith who come there. This is almost sacrilegious to say in Burma, but I don't believe that there's 135 ethnic groups in the country. I think this is a big problem, and I think it's a problem that goes back to the British censuses. I think it goes back to colonial ethnographers that were trying to kind of slice and dice the country into recognizable racial and ethnic categories that they could help then administer and control. And the Burmese kind of, sort of took on board these sort of self-identities and then used them for different purposes. I mean, Burma, the British wrote or not the British, but a British person wrote in 1911, I think it was, in a critical way. He said Burma was a zone of racial instability, by which he meant that people in Burma were kind of moving around from one identity to another. And he went to one village where the people said they were Shan, but they said their parents had been Kachin and their grandparents were something else and they couldn't remember what they were. And for the British said, this person says he's Anglo-Burmese, but he's actually this or that, or these Indians come from India and they're actually of this very low caste, or they're untouchables, but they say they're Christian, or they say that. And people were changing around. And I think there's something actually in modern Burmese history in which Burma really is a place where people have very different and mixed and fluid and contingent identities. And this effort to fix those identities, and even worse, to set off these identities against one another, I think is the root of a big part of the problem in the country today. Because then if you have these essential categories, then you have to ask yourself, do the Rohingya exist as this category, and how do they fit within the 135, or are they excluded from the 135? But I think that framing of the whole thing is the problem in the first place. And I think the more that we can teach kids history in a different way and appreciate that these identities in Burma have always been very fluid and contingent and very personal, I think we come at the problem in a different way, and I think different kinds of solutions will present themselves much more easily.
Okay, we have time for a couple more. Yeah, the gentleman there and the gentleman there. Yep.
My name is Richard Klein. I've been involved for the past 8 years in a medical project in Myanmar, first with a Buddhist NGO, and then finally we were allowed to work in government hospitals. The government spends virtually nothing on health care, virtually nothing. What will have to happen in the country for the government to put resources into health care for the people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I think it goes back to what was said earlier. I mean, as long as Burma's nascent democratic institutions are focused on a very narrow political debate about constitutional futures and a few other things, or really nothing in terms of substance and policy, I think it's going to be difficult. I think on the one hand, people know that they want better healthcare. They know they want better education. No one's against that. But nobody is putting on the table genuine plans for a new national healthcare system. And no one is presenting different kinds of alternatives. We could have an alternative where there's a big private sector for healthcare. You could have an alternative which is universal healthcare for everyone. And this is how much it would cost, and this is what the plans are. But nobody is doing
Medicare
that.
for all.
You could have Medicare for all. But this is actually the thing, because in the West, and in countries, the United States and the UK and other countries, I mean, there are lots of interesting, you would say frustrating discussions, but also interesting discussions on the future of many of the issues that people in Burma should also be thinking about and debating. Yet Burma is often never connected to those debates. And instead, what's being offered in Burma are very stale formulas around just have elections, just have free market reforms, just to open up your country. And I think the more that we can use the civil society space that's there, the fact that the internet is free in Burma, to inject a lot of new ideas on political economy issues. And I would say, universal healthcare and having a new national healthcare system is a big political economy issue. I think that's what's needed. Otherwise, in the absence of that, basically, people will not have the ability to articulate a more progressive agenda with which to, as content for their democratic politics, and instead people will mobilize around identity issues, which I think has been the bane of Burmese politics since independence.
Well, the microphone is passing. I promised this gentleman with the scarf there. Just a quick one coming to us via Twitter. Wayne Goodman, Myanmar needs help. What do you see as the position the United States and its citizens should be taking, if any? And I should say, in the book, I think you make the point that a lot of American positions that have been taken over the past couple of decades have been misguided or counterproductive. What should we be doing now?
Yeah, it's hard to say, because I think, on the one hand, I mean, I was always very critical of economic sanctions back in the 90s and the 2000s, because I think they were counterproductive, and I think in hindsight that's even more clear. Right now we're in a situation where America is not a big. America doesn't have a very dynamic foreign policy in many parts of the world, diplomatic, and people are
said, yes,
and people are obviously very much focused on internal politics here. To be honest, I don't really know what the U.S. could do very differently. I mean, I think the U.S. has tried to follow a balanced position in Myanmar. They've shown a huge amount of focus and interest in human rights issues, including on the Rohingya, but also in relation to the peace process. At the same time, it's continued to engage the government and provide support where it can provide support. So I think it's a good, balanced kind of policy. I'm not sure exactly if there's a magic formula that the U.S. could undertake at this time that would really make a big difference.
What about? We haven't talked much about private investment.
Yeah.
I mean, what about that conference that I referenced that we had here 6 years ago now?
Yeah.
There were a lot of businesses in the room.
Yeah.
I mean, what's Are there what's needed?
The thing is,
to maybe mitigate a little bit of the China issue you
yeah,
mentioned?
I mean, but I think on the one hand, Burma needs everything, right? And the domestic capital isn't there unless you get the meth industry involved. I suppose would be a possibility. The domestic, and that's actually not a complete joke because there's now a new law which will legalize casinos in the country, and the casinos in the country have been a huge mechanism for laundering money. There are hundreds of casinos on the Chinese border. But anyway, leaving that issue aside, there's not the domestic capital to move Burma's economy forward at the pace that it should move forward, right? So there's a big need for foreign investment pretty much in every sector across the board. And a lot of companies, Western companies and others, are not investing in Burma, I think a little bit on reputational risk issues, but a lot just because the business climate isn't there to justify that investment. But I think the problem is in the other direction, which is that until the Burmese people, the Burmese government, Burmese society has a clear vision of the kind of economy it wants in 10, 20 years' time, it's hard to know what the right mix of policy should be in terms of the type of foreign investment it wants to attract, right? There could be sectors where it opens itself up completely to foreign businesses and foreign investment. Other sectors it wants to protect because it wants to grow local companies. Other sectors, maybe healthcare, maybe say railways or transportation or anything, that it wants actually to be under state ownership. So, but it's never come to that kind of vision in terms of how it sees the economy moving ahead and how it wants to see it structured. And I think without that, that also hinders foreign businesses because when they come to invest, I think the government in general, I mean the Naypyidaw, the capital, is that much less ready to kind of judge whether it wants this particular investment or not.
Okay, the gentleman's been waiting for a while. Yes, sir.
Hello.
I'll just speak. If you can use the microphone, otherwise folks...
Hello? Can you?
Right.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Dan. I'm from NYU. I'm from Rangoon. I have not a problem really, more of a question. So, in Burma, we have this issue of accountability and transparency when it comes to businesses, when it comes to, say, policy measures. We've seen that with the Justice for Victoria instance, where there has been a lot of problem trying to get the police to solve a particular case. And this problem could be extended to a wide variety of issues, business, foreign policy, you name it. Regarding what you said earlier about economic development, well, emphasis on economic development without so much on political, well, I can't quite recall how you phrased it, but somewhere along the lines of more economic development and less for democracy. I think, I don't know. So, do you think it's feasible in order for Burma to have a lot of capital injection without sufficient level of accountability? We could be diving right into what we saw with Eastern Europe and South Africa and, many parts of Asia where you see a lot of oligarchs and you have a lot of, say, regulatory capture.
No, that's absolutely the problem. And that's why I think the focus has to be on how to address that specific issue. Because if you just take the economic system as it is, right, the system as it's grown up over the last 25 years, you see how weak state institutions are, whether it's on taxation or whether it's the judiciary or whether it's the ability of the state to plan the economy. And you just open the door to any kind of foreign investment in competition from China or from elsewhere, and you just sort of turbocharge the economy as it is. You'll wind up with an even more unequal society. You'll wind up with all the problems that we've had over the past 20 years, but even worse. It's not about choosing between development and democracy. It's about making sure that democracy is about development in the way that's good for ordinary people, right? Otherwise, if you have democracy and people have elections and they choose between 3 or 4 different parties who say the exact same kind of, very surface thing about a number of different issues, then what's the point, right? But you want a democracy in which it's a deliberative democracy, but it's also a democracy that really comes to grips with these core issues, which is about how is the economy going to be managed. And you're absolutely right that if you just keep the system as it is without reform, and you just kind of open the door and you should hope for more investment and more capital going in, it will just make a lot of these problems worse over time. And I think, you know, the part that we hadn't talked about in the history is that partly because of British colonialism and a legacy of British colonialism is that from 1948 onwards, Burmese politics was dominated by the left. And you had different socialist groups and communist groups vying for power from the 40s, 50s, 60s,
Right.
70s. And they were all seen to have failed by the 1980s. But that collapse of the left means that there is no language that's seen as credible to articulate a more progressive agenda in the country. So we live in the kind of the aftermath of this collapse of different socialist and communist attempts or experiments. And people, I think, want something very different from a crony-run economy, but don't really have the conceptual framework around which to try to change things. And maybe just lastly to say that, you know, on all of these kinds of issues about institutional reform and the ability to deal with different cases, you mentioned the Victoria case, which is a child sexual abuse case. You know, in a way, the problem is that what you need with, you know, these huge bureaucracies of tens of thousands of people who've been, you know, these bureaucracies that have kind of warped and mutated under years of dictatorship and autocracy, to kind of know where to even start in changing the education system or know where to start in terms of changing the judicial system requires sort of a team of super managers. And, you know, the NLD and politicians today, for no fault of their own, they've been locked up for decades, are not super managers, right? And you kind of need to know, how do we sequence, where do we start, who do we fire, who do we hire, where do we focus on in terms of these different bureaucracies to move this forward. I just don't see the capacity to do that right now.
We're approaching the witching hour, and I asked you a personal question about that trip you made when you were 8 years old, and I just was thinking, would love to know, if you don't mind sharing, you're still young. With all these problems in your country, what do you want to do next? What are your hopes, dreams, ambitions?
Yeah, I don't know really. I think I've just spent. It's been a big effort to try to finish this book over this year. So I'm hoping over the next few months to kind of think a little bit about what to do next. You know, I left to go to Burma in 2007 because I've been working a lot on UN reform.
Right.
And I thought that Burma reform would be much easier than UN reform. And that was the case, at least for a little while. But now things seem very difficult. But, so I don't know, is the honest answer to the question.
Right. Well, Thant Myint-U, the book is terrific. It's The Hidden History of Burma. There are copies in the back if they haven't all sold already. I also, just a shout out to all of you who ask questions. I mean, they're always of a high caliber here. I'm just struck by how many of the people who ask questions actually asked with personal experience from the country. So thank you all for coming. We'll see you on December 2nd, if not sooner. And thank you to Thant Myint-U. Thank you very much.
Yeah.